Good morning, Israel. Today is the 20th day of the first month, and today is also the Sabbath, so Shabbat Shalom. But it's actually a very special Sabbath. It is the first Sabbath of 7 Sabbaths heading up to the Feast of Weeks, which we're going to talk about here a little bit more in a second. And today is also the 5th day of the Omer count. And so, without further ado, let's jump into what we're going to be talking about today. We have been going over how to calculate or count the Omer, or how do we figure our count to the Feast of Weeks. And as we were looking last week, we were looking at the resurrection as a New Testament or New Covenant writing evidence that the Omer was counted from the 16th, because when the scripture says Messiah rose on Mia Sabbaton, it indicates that that Omer count would have had to start before or on that day, if it was Mia Sabbaton, the day he rose from the grave, which it was. So that was the first of 7 Sabbaths. So, and actually today is Mia Sabbaton on the calendar, although it's not the 17th as it was in the year 34 CE. Nevertheless, today is Mia Sabbaton, the day, kind of the anniversary day of the resurrection of Yahushua Messiah. So it's very significant. And we're going to look at another New Testament passage that also confirms that the Omer count actually starts from the 16th of the first month. Today we'll be looking at the book of Luke, chapter 6. We're going to start in verses 1 and 2. Now it came about on the first Sabbath, he was passing through some of the grain fields, and his disciples were picking and eating the heads of grain, rubbing them in their hands. But some of the Pharisees said, "Why do you do what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" Now we're going to take a little bit closer look at this verse and actually the context, but specifically this word, second first, in the Greek, and kind of see what this is referring to, the first Sabbath. What is this? This Greek word, G1207, is a composite word, deuteros and protos, which deuteros means second, protos means first. When literally translated, it is second first, the second first. So what is the first Sabbath? Well, it is the first of 7 Sabbaths intervening before Pentecost. And this is kind of what we've been talking about before. And we're going to look at this in another translation and just a little bit of commentary and look at the year that this actually took place. In the Hebrew version of Luke 6:1, they translate it this way: "And it was on the day of the Sabbath, after being waved the Omer, and he went into the fields of grain, and his disciples plucked from the ears, and they rubbed them in their hands, and they ate." Notice how it says, after being waved the Omer. Here's John Wesley's commentary on Luke 6:1. "And the first Sabbath, so the Jews reckoned their Sabbaths from Passover to Pentecost, the first, the second, the third, and so on to the 7th Sabbath after the second day. This immediately preceded Pentecost, which was the 50th day after the second day of unleavened bread." Matthew 12:1 and Mark 2:23. Notice again how John Wesley understood this was from the second day of unleavened bread, which is the 16th. Now, the events in Luke 6:1 and 2 occurred in the first month of 31 CE. We may have to do another talk on how we know that, but the events in question happened on the 18th day of the first month in that year, which was the first of the 7 Sabbaths leading up to Pentecost. So what does it mean by the first Sabbath? Well, in the Feast of Unleavened Bread was the first Sabbath here. This is known as the High Sabbath. Also, we already looked at in John 19:31, where it mentions the 15th being a high Sabbath. That's why they had to get Messiah down from the stake. But this is the high Sabbath of the 15th. And so the second first Sabbath is right here. It is the second, but it's the first Sabbath of 7 Sabbaths leading up to Shavuot. So that's what that's referring to. Now, why is it important for what we're looking at here? Is because of what's going on in the text. Now, if you remember back in Leviticus 23, verse 14, it specifically states in context, this is the Omer offering. You do not eat bread nor roasted grain or fresh grain until the same day that you have brought an offering to your Elohim, a law forever throughout your generations and all your dwellings. Again, this is specifically referring to the Omer, that you're not allowed to be eating or harvesting or doing anything like that until this offering is done on the 16th day of the first month, after the Sabbath in question. Now, this is interesting because we see on the Sabbath, this first Sabbath, that the disciples were in fact eating grain and picking it and things like that. So they were eating this grain that Leviticus says cannot happen until the Omer wave offering is done. So if you hold to the view that the day you start your Omer count the day after the weekly Sabbath, then the disciples would have actually been in violation of the Torah, and even worse yet, Messiah would have been allowing it. So the reason why Luke has put this in here is to let the reader know, is it gives us very specific timing of the events, the first Sabbath, let you know the Omer had already been waived and the disciples were not breaking the Sabbath. They were actually doing exactly what the Torah had instructed. So what we're going to look at down here, it says the Pharisees said, why do you do what is not lawful on the Sabbath? Well, this is referring to something completely different, and we're going to look at that to kind of bring this context of everything going on into light.